Alrighty, so let's talk about the theory of evolution. So basically, living things adapt and change, and those who do not adapt and change to their environment end up dead, which is not very good. And we call this entire process natural selection. So let's say, for example, that you have a bird with a really thick, short beak that's good for eating nuts and things like that. And then you have a bird with a really long, thin beak that's really good for drinking nectar out of flowers. Well, let's say that one day all the flowers die from an insect or a pesticide or whatever. All of the birds with the long, thin beaks who were eating the nectar from the flowers, those are all going to die off because their food source is now gone. Whereas the birds with the really thick, short beaks for eating nuts, those ones are going to survive because they were better adapted to their environment. That is what natural selection is. And you often hear this termed as survival of the fittest, which means that the organisms best adapted to their environment survive and reproduce. Their babies have the traits that helped their parents survive, and so the best traits get passed down generation after generation. Now, a lot of people think that survival of the fittest means like the strongest thing or the smartest thing, and that's not necessarily true. Again, it depends on how you are best adapted to your environment. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to be the strongest thing ever or the smartest thing ever. And there are three things that naturally fuel natural selection. So in nature, too many babies are born that can naturally survive. Fish, insects lay hundreds of eggs at a time, and maybe 10% of them will make it to adulthood. And you also have variation within a population. So think about humans. Some of us are tall, some of us are short, some of us had red hair, blonde hair, black hair, whatever. So individuals naturally vary within a population, and depending on the trait and how exactly you are varied, you might have an adaptation that is helpful or something that makes you worse off, like the birds with the different beaks. And then you also have competition. So there is not enough food, shelter, partners, whatever, for everyone to live a nice, happy life in nature. So there is competition to compete for those limited resources, and the ones who cannot compete well enough do not survive to pass on their genes to the next generation. And it's because of this entire process that species go extinct, new ones pop up. And this whole theory was proposed by Charles Darwin. He was a naturalist. He went to a bunch of different islands, and he saw how different species were adapted to their specific environments, and this is how he came up with his theory, which is now backed up by a massive amount of evidence. So, speaking of evidence, there are four main types. There's the fossil record, and I'll talk a lot more about that in a second, but basically the fossil record is the running record we have of all the fossils we have found ever, and it shows us how animals have changed over time, plants too. We have biogeography, which is more of how Earth's surface has changed over time, so like continents floating around, volcanoes, earthquakes, that kind of thing. We have modern DNA studies, so we can compare the DNA of a human to a banana, for example, and see how closely related we are. Fun fact, humans and bananas are 60% genetically similar. Fun fact. And then we can see evolution in modern day things like viruses and bacteria. The whole reason you have to go get vaccines, like for the flu, every single year is because the flu virus is constantly evolving and getting stronger, so we have to make new vaccines to try to fight that. All right, so moving on to fossils. Fossils are the preserved remains of organisms that lived in the past, and the conditions to make a fossil kind of have to be perfect. So most of the time when you die, something eats you, whether it's worms or a scavenger or something, but most of the time something eats you. So in order to become a fossil, after you die, you have to become buried in sediment or rocks very, very quickly so nothing can eat you. And if you get buried quickly enough, depending on the type of fossil you end up becoming, either your bones can turn into actual rocks or your body will make an imprint into actual rocks. And so if you do become a fossil, it is more likely to happen if you are made out of hard stuff like bones or shells. Softer things like skin, muscles, feathers, plants are generally softer. Those things are less likely to become fossilized. So when you look at the fossil record, we mostly see animals with hard parts. So the fossil record is biased in that way. we don't know nearly as much about ancient plants or fungi as we do compared to actual animals. So there are several different types of fossils. We have trace fossils, that would be the evidence of the actual animal. So like a footprint, poop, for example, a nest, and then you can have actual body fossils, which would be the actual body of the organism. And like I said earlier, the fossil record is the record of every fossil that we have discovered ever. And when we look at the fossil record as a whole, it shows us how Earth has changed over time. And the fossil record is organized, and geologic time in general is organized into these different eras, eons, periods, and that will be another video later on. And I have another PowerPoint about fossils. That's also important. I want to mention that too. Fossils are always found in sedimentary rock. If you remember, whenever you studied rocks back in the past, sedimentary rock are rocks that are made up of sediments layering on top of each other, whereas igneous and metamorphic rocks are rocks that are formed by heat and are melting. So if you heat and or melt a fossil, you destroy it. So fossils are only found in sedimentary rocks. And again, you have to be buried very quickly in order to become fossilized. If you don't necessarily get buried, there are some other options for you too. Sometimes you can get covered in amber. This is a lot more rare, but if you remember from the Jurassic Park movies, the staff the guy carries around with the mosquito in it that they supposedly got the dinosaur blood from, that actually happens. You can find insects, little frog things, really smaller stuff preserved in amber. The same thing can happen in a tar pit. You can be buried in tar and preserved in that way, or in a bog pit. Y'all should Google the Bog Man. That's an interesting story. And you can also be frozen. We have found a couple baby woolly mammoths that way, frozen in ice. And along with body and trace fossils within those categories, there's other categories. So you can be a mold fossil, which is where you're actually indented into the rock. Like this trilobite thing right here, this would be the mold. This would be the cast part, the part that's like sticking out in the 3D thing. And you can also be petrified, which is where the minerals from the rock actually like leach into the plant material or the bone material and turn you into rock. I don't want to worry about those two. A couple other ways that we can learn about ancient Earth is also by studying tree rings and ice cores. So with tree rings, whenever you cut a tree down, you see that the tree is made up of all these different rings. Depending on the size and shape of the rings, we can make inferences as to what the weather was like. For example, if it was a really hot, wet summer, lots of rain, the tree was doing good that year, it would be a nice thick ring. To show that the tree was doing good, growing a lot. Whereas if you have like a really skinny ring, maybe it was extra cold, maybe it didn't rain that much, the tree didn't grow that much. And then with ice cores, if you go to really cold places and drill down into the ice, remember how I said, fossils can freeze in ice? Other things freeze in ice too, like air particles and dirt and that kind of thing. So when you drill down and get an ice core and analyze the stuff frozen in the ice, whether it's air or dust or whatever, you can also tell what Earth used to be like. We can figure out how much oxygen was in the air, if there were any volcanic eruptions, changes in climate, things like that as well. And we talked about the fossil record. One more thing I want to add to fossils. Okay. So we also have the law of superposition. So basically the law of superposition says that the deeper you dig down, the older stuff it gets. So if I'm digging like 500 feet below the surface, might be like 500 years old, whereas I'm digging 100 feet above the surface, that might be 100 years old. That's not exact, but I'm giving an example. So we can use this to do what we call relative dating. So let's say I'm digging in a rock layer and I find some fossils and I'm not exactly sure how old they are, but let's say I find a trilobite and I know for sure that trilobites are 100 million years old, for example. Anything I find above that trilobite is going to be younger than 100 million years old, and anything below the trilobite is going to be more than 100 million years old. And the trilobite in this case would be an example of an index fossil. An index fossil is a fossil that you for sure know the age of, and it's pretty common, so you can use it to relatively date other things. And we say it's relative dating because it can help us figure out like approximate ages, but not exact ages. Exact ages would be more of like a carbon dating kind of thing. So relative dating, we can figure out approximate ages based on things that we already know the exact age of. So remember that as well. And I think that's it.